Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly edition of The Wrap. I'm Laura Leslie, WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief.
And I am Will Doran, WRAL State Government Reporter.
We are back after a little hiatus there, just in time for the primaries. Lots of interesting primaries going on. We'll also talk about the Leandro hearing here in a minute, but we had to tick through some of these primary stories that are just popping up as we get closer and closer to the day. One of them you wrote about today, Will, and that was we'll call it mischief, if not interference, but Republican money flowing into, or what appears to be Republican money flowing into some Democratic primaries.
Yeah, mischief, shenanigans.
Shenanigans, that's a good one.
Yeah, so there are some pretty closely contested Democratic primaries, a few in state legislative seats, and then for the Attorney General's race, that where the kind of the biggest player in the primary election is Republicans, and not any of the Democratic candidates who are actually running for these seats. And they're kind of taking two different approaches. In the AG's race, you've got Jeff Jackson, congressman from Charlotte, pretty well known statewide, big social media presence, not exactly a moderate, but more moderate than, say, Tana DeBerry, who is his main opponent, the district attorney in Durham, very reform-minded DA.
Right.
And there have been these flyers going out backing DeBerry and, saying, she's the progressive candidate, come out and vote for her. And you look into who's paying for these flyers, it's this brand new super PAC from D.C. And they have not yet filed any paperwork that would show who is funding them, anything like that. But what we do know is that they use a bank that's this really weird kind of niche bank for Republican political campaigns, like Trump's campaign banks there, the John McCain campaign bank there when he was running for president. I think Romney's campaign bank there. It's kind of like the Republican political bank. And then they also use an ad buyer who's tied to a bunch of different Republican congressmen and campaigns. So it seems to be a GOP group. Like I said, we don't know actually who's funding it right now.
But Jeff Jackson thinks he does.
Yeah, Jeff Jackson tells us that it is a Republican operation to harm him.
And he went up on Twitter today with a 2-minute or so video kind of talking about the fact that he thinks this group is in line to spend about $1 million on this race, and that's far outspending what he and DeBerry are spending.
Yeah, I mean, he has a few $1 million in his campaign account, I believe. Certainly in his congressional account. DeBerry does not.
Sure.
So it's big amounts of money, and we're seeing the same thing in a couple of state house races as well. There are two Democrats who are on the more moderate side of the aisle, and they have voted actually with Republicans on several pretty contentious votes this past session. Roy Cooper vetoed, I think it was 19 bills this year, lost all of those veto efforts. Yep. But on a few of them, you had a handful of Democrats who would side with Republicans, and two of them are Cecil Brockman and Michael Ray, who are now facing primary challenges from much more progressive opponents. And they both have really deep blue districts, and whoever wins this Democratic primary is going to win in November as well. Right. And so there's a Republican group that's actually tied to House Speaker Tim Moore, not really officially, but it's founded by allies of his and people who have similar interests, and it's spending big in both of these races to support both Ray and Brockman, and citing especially their vote for the state budget this year. I think there were only 5 Democrats in the entire legislature out of almost 70 who voted for the budget. They were 2 of them, and with the voucher expansion and some other pro-business bills that they voted for, like the Farm Act, that has won support from these conservative groups.
It's good to have friends in high places, yeah?
Indeed.
Yeah. Another place where we are seeing some money spent, although not by the opposing party in this case, is the State Senate 13 race, and that is the Republican primary, and that is Scott Lasseter versus Vicky Harry, a political newcomer here in North Carolina. You might remember Scott Lasseter as the person who sued Speaker Tim Moore for alienation of affection last year.
Right, which is the law that we have here in North Carolina that is a very fancy way of saying broke up the marriage.
Yeah. So The two of them are vying for this open state Senate seat, and I live in that district, and I have never seen so many flyers for any Republican. I mean, any primary, let alone, let's just say, race, legislative race.
I don't live in that district, but I live near it, and I can't drive more than 20 feet without seeing another yard sign.
So, Scott, we got Scott Lasseter spending money here, and probably quite a bit of it at this point with this many flyers. And then we've got Vicky Harry, but some of Vicky Harry's stuff and some of the anti-Lasseter stuff has come from a PAC that does not seem to be affiliated with Vicky Harry.
I'm sensing a similar theme here in our discussion so far.
But this PAC, I think you mentioned, you had talked to Scott Lasseter about, and he's pretty convinced that it too is linked to House Republican leadership.
Yes, and you might be asking, why does House Republican leadership care about a
Tim
Senate
Moore got
primary?
Sued. Tim Moore got sued by Scott Lasseter. That would do it.
Exactly. Yeah. But no, he says that this is funded by a PAC connected to some high up Republicans. He's named Representative Jason Sain. I haven't had a time myself to dig into these things, but he's pretty convinced. He thinks that the knives are out to get him. So,
well, there is a PAC that is running some ads for Lasseter, or paying for some flyers for Lasseter. So they've both got some PAC money on their side, but it's just very interesting. And it's also, I mean, even though they're just flyers, that many flyers, that's a lot of money to spend for a state Senate district, you know, especially one that has a Democratic sort of incumbent that's going to be running in it.
Sort of
an incumbent.
Yeah.
Incumbent to the district number, not to the neighborhood, right? Okay, and that's Lisa Grafstein, of course.
Yeah, she's from North Raleigh, has represented North Raleigh, but in the latest round of redistricting, her district got moved to Southern Wake County.
Yep, and so she moved too.
And so, yeah, she is an incumbent, but, the voters in that area, aren't used to her being their state senator, so... It'll be interesting. I've talked to people. On paper, that district looks like it's pretty much a toss-up, but talking to some operatives behind the scenes, they say even if it looks like a toss-up on paper, that's using 2020 numbers, and Wake County is moving so far to the left and so quickly that even something that looked like a toss-up in 2020 is probably safely Democratic at this point. So we'll see. I mean, Republicans obviously think they've got a shot. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending all this money on the primary.
Right, exactly.
But
all right. So, and then another place we're seeing a lot of money spent in a primary is the 13th district GOP primary. And we say GOP because honestly, that's the race, right? There's one Democratic, Franklin Pierce, who's running Democratic candidate. So there's no primary on that side. But this, I think somebody told me that this was like a plus 10 or plus 12 Trump district.
I think it's more. I think it's close to plus 20.
Yeah. So, and this is the newly drawn 13th. So the one that used to be sort of this little compact district that was Southern Wake County and Johnson Harnett, is now sort of is Franken district that reaches up around Wake County and down below it. And
it had been represented by Democrat Wiley Nickel, but he's not even running for re-election this year because it's such an impossible task.
Exactly. So you can pretty much figure that whoever wins this primary is probably going to win the seat. And it's probably a pretty safe seat for that,
Mm-hmm.
So we've got basically, it looks like 3 or 4 major candidates. And
but 14 total Republicans running in this primary.
Yes.
I mean,
Well, I mean, honestly, to speak the truth here, it makes more sense to do that than it does to run for lieutenant governor. But what do I digress. Anyway, so you've got Kelly Daughtry, the daughter of Leo Daughtry. You've got Brad Knott, former prosecutor, or maybe current, I don't know. And then you've also got Fred Von Cannon, who is sort of the pick of the social conservatives. And then Devon Barber, who's been a long time sort of fixture in the Republican Party. He ran, I think, in 2022, but lost to Bo Hines.
Yeah, he came in second in the GOP primary last time around.
Right. And so, the people who are spending the most money at this point are going to be Daughtry, Von Cannon, and Knott. And just recently, we started seeing negative ads in that race. And the negative ads are against Daughtry and Von Cannon. And they are coming from American Foundations Camp Committee, which is a PAC, and they are funded largely, it appears, by 2 brothers of Brad Knott, who gave $550 million in November, December alone.
$550,000.
Sorry, $1,000, yes, $550,000 in November, December alone. It looks like that PAC has spent more than $1 million in this cycle.
Yeah,
I
nice
don't
to
know.
have rich brothers, I suppose.
Right. But the PAC is really fascinating because it's been around a long time. It started back in 2012. And it was, I think you told me that it was started to support George Holding.
Yes, and it was founded by Knott's dad, Joe Knott, who's a very prominent Raleigh attorney.
Yeah, so it's been given to for a long time and given to by some of the bigs, your Bob Luddies, Neil Hunt, for example, is another donor. Luther is another donor. Hodges. Yeah, they have really cleaned out that PAC in Knott's behalf, both for and against. So,
yeah, the kind of old money Raleigh crew seems to be very, very intent on helping them out. And we'll see if that's enough. I mean, the main population base of that district is Johnston County. And so, someone who, is kind of Raleigh royalty may have a bit of a disadvantage. But then at the same time, you have both Daughtry and Barber who are from Johnston County. Maybe they kind of split that base of support there and, open the door to some other candidates.
It's fascinating. We'll be watching that one really closely. Anyway, moving along to things that are, one more thing to mention. Donald Trump endorsed Speaker Timur for his congressional district.
He did.
Yep.
I don't think that was too much of a surprise, although Trump hasn't been endorsing in every race. He hasn't endorsed in the 13th district, for instance.
It didn't work out last time.
No. Yeah. Bo Hines won the primary because he got the Trump endorsement, and then I think a lot of people believe he lost the general because he got the Trump endorsement.
Yeah, exactly. So, you have to be careful, I guess. But anyway, okay, so on to things that are not primary related. Number one, the big news of the week, of course, the Leandro hearing. That was the 5th time this lawsuit has been in front of the state Supreme Court since this started back in the 1990s. How did we get here?
Well, it's been a long and winding road. I mean, the lawsuit's all about, are we spending enough money on public education here in North Carolina? And it's because there's a specific part of the state constitution that says, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's not just that you have to, provide public schools for all kids to be able to attend. They have to be good, too.
Sound basic education.
There you go.
And that is the state's duty to guard and maintain that is what it's in it. So, so the question, of course, is in the Leandro case long ago, the state Supreme Court, and this was with Republicans in the majority, found that the state was not doing its job in making sure that some students in some of the poorer counties, Hoke and Halifax initially were the plaintiffs, were not receiving that education because those counties did not have the tax base to supplement what they were getting from the state. So what the judges said at the time is that the state needed to come up with more. Now the question is, when did it become a statewide decision? When did it become more than Hoke and Halifax County and statewide? And legislators, attorney Matthew Tilley was arguing on Thursday that it never did, that there was never any decision by the court that this was supposed to be a statewide thing. Well, there have been some decisions actually, and Allison Riggs read from some of them in court. But this is basically a do-over that's sort of outside the bounds of the normal court rules in terms of reconsidering settled decisions.
And that's, continuing a trend that we've seen a lot. It was, I think, in 2022 that the Supreme Court kind of ruled in favor of the Democrats in the Leandro case and sort of approved the plan that they wanted. And, they also, issued some rulings against gerrymandering, against voter ID. Of course, Republicans then flipped the court a few months after those rulings came out. Voters made their will known, and the new Republican justices have come in and undone a lot of what the Democrats had did just a year or two prior.
Right. So this is one more thing there. Yeah.
This is one more. Obviously, they have not ruled yet, but from reading our reporting and hearing from people who were in the courtroom watching it, it seems that they are primed to probably undo that previous ruling.
There was a lot of skepticism about it. Although I thought it was interesting that Judge Dietz, Richard Dietz, was talking about what if it was a class action suit, like trying to find a way to split that hair, right? What if there was a way to make sure that the money would still go to the schools, but they wouldn't have to rule that the legislature could have the money that it's supposed to spend spent by the judiciary?
Yeah. Well, because it's not just this philosophical question of are we spending enough money? It's can the courts force the legislature to spend money when the legislature doesn't want to? And, and that goes to the separation of powers. And so, there's all these different issues happening all at once here that, make this complicated.
But we should mention, too, that this started in 1994. And so we've had legislatures dominated by Democrats, legislatures dominated by Republicans. None of them have paid up. None of them. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
So it's at what point after 30 years, at what point does the judiciary say, okay, if you won't do what we're telling you to do, then we're going to make you do it?
Right. Well, and I mean, you look at, testing numbers and, a majority of kids, struggle with reading, struggle with math. And, it's pretty bleak when you look at some of these numbers.
Yeah. Hard to argue that the schools don't need more help than they're getting. That's for sure. Also this week, I think a shot across the bow would be the way I would put it from Senator Michael Lazzara about DMV privatization. So there's not a bill yet. There's not even a plan for a bill yet. There's a study underway that was commissioned in last year's budget looking at whether or not privatizing the DMV, some or all of its functions, would be a good idea for the state. And I mean, some things are already privatized, right? Like your license plate agencies, those are third party. You get your car inspections done by private businesses,
right?
So some parts of it already are, but there's been a lot of frustration primarily around customer service. And what Lazzara said is, there's a lot of frustration out there, and they're getting calls from their constituents.
Yeah, and I do not doubt at all that there's frustration with customer service with the DMV. But anyone who's ever gone and tried to renew their license or renew their plate and has gone to one of those offices that, as you said, have already been privatized, they probably haven't seen much better treatment. I mean, I remember a few years ago, I was trying to, my license was expired, or my plate was expired, and I had to get a new one. And I had to find an appointment, I think it was like 3 months out in Siler City was the closest place. So I had to drive out to Siler City like 3 months from the time that I was looking, because that was the closest thing I could find anywhere in the state to even just get an appointment to go and show the people my paperwork.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that, I mean, a lot of states are looking at this or have looked at this. They have not pulled the trigger.
Yeah.
So, and I think part of that is because there are, the DMV has access to some really confidential, sensitive information about people. And they also have access to criminal records and voter registration records, right? I mean, how much access do you want to give private parties, third parties, to that kind of government-protected information that's required by the federal government to be protected?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Most people sign up to vote through the DMV.
Right.
When they move to North Carolina or, when they turn of age and go get their license, you can also, sign up to be a voter.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, there is obviously some ability to have some oversight when that's still a government agency. Who knows what would happen if that were to be privatized. And, the DMV has kind of been kicked around a little bit recently. They moved the headquarters from downtown Raleigh out to Rocky Mount.
Right.
And, so it's kind of, had its share of lumps.
I will say, in their defense, I was out at the Avon Ferry license branch, right, trying to get people to talk to us. And everybody was walking in and walking out. And they're like, no, it only took like 20 minutes. It was fine.
All right.
So they were doing something right at that one, I guess.
Well, maybe things have improved since I had to go to Siler City back in, I think that was maybe like 2021 or something like that.
The AI roundtable, you covered that. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So we had two members of Congress were here in Durham this week, Representative Deborah Ross and Representative Valerie Foushee. They are Democrats who represent the Triangle up in D.C., and they were here with a bunch of pretty high-powered business executives. I mean, top brass from IBM, Cisco, SAS, plus some university researchers from UNC, Duke, NC Central, and the meeting was at NC Central, talking about AI. And they are both on different committees in Congress that are looking at ways to regulate artificial intelligence as we kind of enter this brave new world of AI and everything that it can do from, they talked about, it's not just being used in political ads. It's not just being used to, create funny images that you post on social media. It's, used to create entire new songs and
content
and content, and
And if you've been following the news, chatbot had a meltdown this week and it went off the deep end, right?
Right, and do robocalls and run customer service for a lot of big companies. I mean, it's everywhere, and there have been meltdowns. There's lots of ethical issues, especially around things like facial recognition and deep fake images and issues like that. And so there's kind of this growing sense that Congress needs to do something about this because it's just a completely unregulated field right now. But the question is what? And so that's what they were here to talk about. They said they want to have another one of these meetings, and there's pretty good conversation, some pro-business views, some pro-regulation views, just some kind of just general, things that people brought up it's
fascinating.
I don't know that Congress can really get anything done right now, but I talked to Representative Ross after the meeting. She said, Congress isn't exactly not dysfunctional at the moment, but this is bipartisan that we're working on, and there is some hope that it can get done.
Pardon me. Sorry. Did you realize it's already allergy season in February?
My grass is blooming and green, and
it's all right. Yes. Okay, good. Moving on to other stuff that's going on this week. This is coming up this next week. Hassan Bakot.
Yes, this is the revival of the Racial Justice Act appeals, and people remember, in the early 2000s, because of advances in DNA, we started realizing that a lot of people who we had convicted of murder and rape and serious crimes were actually innocent, and so then, some of those people have been facing the death penalty, and so then in 2009, the legislature passed the Racial Justice Act, which said, okay, if you believe that you were sentenced to death and it was, influenced by racism at trial, whether that was through the prosecution or the jury selection or what have you, you can have a chance to appeal it and get a new trial, get your sentence reduced, get it looked at again.
And there were some people who got theirs commuted.
Yes, there were at least 4 people who got their death sentences reduced to life in prison. That happened in 2012. In 2013, the legislature repealed the law. They said, we don't want to do this anymore.
But that left a bunch of people in limbo, right? Those people who had filed their appeals between 2009 and 2013.
Correct, because the legislature said not only are we repealing this for everyone in the future, also anyone who's already started this process has to stop. And in 2020, the state Supreme Court stepped in and said that's unconstitutional. You can't stop, someone
retroactively.
Right, you can't retroactively enforce this law. And so now we have kind of the first of these cases is coming back up again and has some what his advocates say is basically new evidence about the pervasive nature of systemic racism in the justice system, and how often black people are struck from juries. I think it says something like half of everyone on death row in North Carolina was put there by an all-white jury.
Wow.
Or where it was 11 of the 12 were white. And so they're trying to argue some of this evidence. The Attorney General's office is trying to delay this and potentially stop it. I mean, that's their job. They are in charge of defending appeals from the state. But it's kind of caused a political issue for Josh Stein, who is, the Attorney General and is running for governor. And his main opponent for governor is Mike Morgan, the former state Supreme Court justice, who signed on to that 2020 Supreme Court ruling that I just mentioned that let all these cases happen again. And he has been really highly critical of Stein for fighting these cases and trying to delay and potentially stop this from going forward.
I actually asked Josh Stein about that today because I was doing interviews for Stories Next Week on the races. And he said, he pointed out that he was one of the original backers of the Racial Justice Act. He just pointed that, but he said, statutorily, the office is required to defend state laws.
Yeah.
And so that's just, it's not because of personal support, is what he said.
Yeah, and it does, I suppose, reflect how your personal views can, not always align with your official duties.
True. Yeah. Although Josh Stein has been known to not enforce laws he didn't agree with.
That's true.
Just going to point that out. Anyway, moving on to one other really interesting story this week, and this is big kudos to the state, basically Division of Cultural Resources. They put together this really cool website called Naming to Knowing, and it basically gives you a look at the enslaved people who built the state capitol. it was 1833 to 1840, I think, or something along those lines. And we've never known the names of a lot of those slaves because they weren't counted on censuses until 1850. So there's no way genealogically to track them, right? But they discovered in their research in the archives a report, a legislative report of all things, right? A report to an oversight commission. There you go.
Yep.
But it had all the names of the laborers and the quarry people, and it also listed the first and last names and whether or not they were slaves. So they had this basically list of more than 130 people who worked on the state capitol, including one who, those beautiful desks.
Mm-hmm.
He made the desks, Andy Lockhart.
Wow.
Yeah, and the desks are still there. Went on to have
200 years later almost.
I know, isn't that amazing? Wow. So if you have some time and you're interested in history or genealogy or civil rights, it is definitely worth going and checking out that website. It's namingtoknowing.org is what it is. I also have a story up on it online with a link to it. But
yeah, your report was great. I would definitely encourage people to go look at that.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. So neat stuff to round out the week. Next week, we're watching a lot of oversights, and we're going to have very special on the record next weekend with Chris Cooper and Michael Bitzer. A little preview for the primary, so you want to catch that as well.
Primaries are coming up. We got less than 2 weeks. I mean,
know.
It is crunch time here. We are Super Tuesday state now, which hasn't always been the case in the past, and it's moving fast.
Just going to put this out there. If you want to vote early and you want to vote on a weekend, this is your time. Don't wait, because the last Saturday tends to get pretty busy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and we will catch you next week, we hope, here on The Wrap.